Imagine for a second that you have just landed the absolute biggest job of your life. You are running the country, or, at the very least, you're a part of that inner circle holding the keys. You've got the motorcade, the office, the whole deal.
I mean, it's the pinnacle of a political career.
Exactly. But there is a catch. And it is a massive, completely non-negotiable catch, with absolute mathematical certainty that you have exactly one term. 5 years, maybe 4. And then you're out.
No re-election campaign.
None. No second chances, no finish the job tour, no comeback special. You are done. And to make it even stickier, you have zero control over who walks in the door right after you. It could be your best friend, or it could be your worst political enemy who, wants to burn down everything you've just built.
That's a terrifying constraint for most politicians.
Yeah.
It completely changes the calculus of power. Usually the whole game is just stay in the game.
Right. But that is the central thought experiment of the deep dive we're tackling today. We're looking at a really fascinating piece of writing called the One-Term Manifesto, specifically an entry titled, "Let's Rethink Parliament, if we tried to fix this in one term."
And I really love this source because it forces us to ask a much more awkward question than usual. Normally, political reform is all about what is the perfect system, or how do we design a utopia? This asks something different. If you had just one stretch of time, what would you change that would actually survive after you leave?
So, mission statement for this deep dive. We aren't talking about policy today, not tax rates or foreign affairs. We are going to explore why boring, and I mean that in the absolute best way, why boring structural changes might actually be more revolutionary than the big, flashy promises we're all used to hearing.
We're going to figure out how to fix 3 very specific enemies of progress.
Yeah.
Churn, compression, and forgetfulness.
I love that trio. It sounds like a really bad indie band. Churn, compression, and forgetfulness.
It does. But they are actually the structural flaws that break governments. And by the end of this, I promise you'll look at something as mundane as a parliamentary calendar and realize it's actually the battlefield where democracy is won or lost.
I never thought I'd be hyped about a calendar, but let's do it. So let's start with the trap. The source points out what it calls the Big Bang Trap. When people sit down to fix politics, where do their minds usually go?
Well, the temptation is always to reach for the biggest levers you can find. You hear it at dinner parties, you hear it on the news. People say, we need to rewrite the entire electoral system, or we need to replace the upper house, or even, let's just write a brand new constitution from scratch.
Right, the burn it all down and start over approach. It feels good to say that. It feels decisive.
It does. It feels structural. It promises a clean break from the mess we're in. But the author of this manifesto argues that proposing these as one-term fixes is actually, slightly dishonest.
Dishonest, that's a pretty strong word. Why dishonest?
It's not that the ideas themselves are wrong. The source is very clear on that. Many of these are great ideas. But they are dishonest as a one-term promise because they demand a level of consensus, of sequencing and follow-through that, realistically, no single parliament can guarantee on its own.
So if I spend my one guaranteed term trying to rewrite the Constitution,
you're going to spend 4 years arguing about commas. You need massive, massive consensus to change a constitution. And if you just force it through on your own without that broad support, what happens the second you leave?
The next person comes in and just tears it up.
Exactly. You haven't built a bridge. You've built a half-finished bridge that the next crew is going to dynamite just because it was your bridge.
So the manifesto pivots. It says, stop asking what would fix everything forever and start asking, what could we change that would still be there if we lost the next election?
That is the key shift. It's all about survivability. And to understand what needs to survive, we have to look at that indie band you mentioned, the trio of dysfunction.
Churn, compression, and forgetfulness. Let's break these down because I think everyone listening will recognize these, not just from politics, but probably from their own chaotic workplaces.
Let's start with churn.
So this is the turnover rate, right?
It is. In many parliamentary systems, and honestly in many corporate C-suites, the average tenure of a leader in a specific role is just shockingly short. We're talking 12 months, maybe 18 months for a minister or a secretary of state.
Which is wild if you think about it. Imagine a huge tech company firing its head of product every 14 months.
Just as they finally figure out where the bathrooms are and how the legacy software works, they're gone. A new person comes in, usually with a mandate to shake things up, so they scrap everything the previous person did.
So you get this perpetual layer of amateurs running these incredibly complex systems, Nobody stays long enough to actually understand the machine they're trying to drive.
Precisely. And that lack of mastery leads directly to the second culprit, compression.
Compression.
Sure.
That creates this feeling of panic.
Yes, it is time getting squeezed. The source describes it as everything feeling rushed. Decisions get made in these bursts of panic rather than through any kind of steady deliberation.
Oh, I feel that. It's that everything is a priority, so nothing is a priority vibe. You're just firefighting.
And when you are firefighting, you don't have time to look back. Which brings us to the third enemy, forgetfulness.
Institutional amnesia.
It's tragic, really. Because of the churn people leaving and the compression no time to think institutions lose their memory, they completely forget why they made a decision 5 years ago.
This connects to that concept of Chesterton's fence, doesn't it?
Perfectly. If you walk fast through a field and see a fence, you might say, this fence is ugly and in my way, tear it down. But if you don't know why the fence was put there in the first place, maybe to keep out wolves, you are going to regret tearing it down very quickly.
But in politics, because of churn and forgetfulness, we're constantly tearing down fences because nobody even remembers the wolves.
And scrutiny usually arrives way too late. We only analyze decisions after they have hardened into full-blown disasters. So instead of learning, we just hit reset.
So we have a system that is rushing, forgetting what it did last time, and constantly swapping out the people in charge. And if that's the diagnosis, then yeah, a new voting system doesn't fix that.
No, you need to fix the conditions of the workplace itself.
Which brings us to the cure. The Manifesto proposes a strategy: conditions over outcomes. What does that actually mean?
This is a subtle, but I think a really profound shift. The source argues that a one-term government shouldn't promise to fix housing or fix healthcare or solve social care within 5 years.
Wait, hold on. If I'm running for office and I stand up and say, hey, everyone, I promise not to fix housing, I am absolutely not getting elected.
And that's the paradox of campaigning versus governing. But look at the reasoning. The source says that pretending complex systems like health or housing can be finished neatly in one term just creates this cycle of overreach and disappointment.
We have all seen that. We will solve the housing crisis by Tuesday. And then 5 years later, well, nothing has changed, or it's even worse.
Right. And that just destroys public trust. The source argues that honesty matters here. Part of rebuilding trust is being clear about what cannot be delivered quickly. So instead of promising a specific outcome like 0 waiting lists, you promise to change the conditions of how decisions get made.
So you're not changing what the decision is, you're changing how the machine works to make the decision in the first place.
Yes, you are trying to make it easier to do careful work and harder to rely on last-minute urgency. You are tuning the engine so the car can actually drive rather than just yelling at the car to go faster.
Okay, I'm sold on the philosophy, but let's get concrete. The source lists 4 specific proposals, and they warn us up front. These are unglamorous. These are the eat your vegetables of political reform.
They really are. Let's start with the first one, the calendar.
The calendar.
Yeah.
We are saving democracy with a Google Cal invite.
It sounds so trivial, doesn't it? But remember, compression. The source proposes a sitting calendar that smooths time out across the year rather than piling it up and releasing it in these huge, frantic bursts.
So instead of cramming all the legislation into a panic right at the end of the session, you actually space it out.
Ideally. In many systems, you have this wash-up period where huge, complex bills are passed in just a few hours because everyone wants to go home for recess. It's like a college student cramming for finals. You aren't learning anything, you are just trying to survive.
And if you force tired people to vote on complex laws at 3 in the morning, you get bad laws.
Of course you do. It's about avoiding that crunch time mentality. If you smooth out the time, you create space for actual thinking. You lower the temperature.
Okay, I can see that. Less 3.0 a.m. voting, more actually reading the bills. What's the next one?
Tenure. More predictable tenure for senior roles.
This one attacks churn.
Precisely. The proposal is simply to keep people in place long enough to learn. The source says we need to stop people from leaving just as they start to understand the systems they're responsible for.
This seems so obvious in any other industry. You wouldn't swap your lead engineer 6 months into a 2-year project. But in politics, cabinet reshuffles are treated like a sport.
And the cost of that sport is competence. Think about the incentives it creates. If I know I'm going to be the housing minister for 4 years, I have to live with the consequences of my own decisions.
Right. If you screw it up in year 1, you're still there in year 3 to deal with the mess.
But if I think I'm moving on to foreign affairs in 6 months, I might just make a flashy short-term decision that looks good on a press release
Yeah.
and let the next person clean up the inevitable disaster. Tenure creates real accountability.
Okay, proposal number 3, early scrutiny.
This one is about what you could call the economics of disagreement. The force argues we need to build scrutiny into the process much, much earlier. Why? Because, as the text says, change is cheap early on.
I love that phrase. Change is cheap early on.
Think about building a house. Moving a wall on the blueprint costs you, what, an eraser? Moving a wall after you've already built the house costs you thousands of dollars and huge delays.
But in politics, we usually wait until the bill is written, the press releases are out, and the minister's reputation is on the line before we start picking it apart.
Exactly. And by that point, disagreement is existential. If you admit you're wrong late in the game, it looks like a collapse. It's a U-turn. But if you argue about it early, when it's just a draft, well, that's just called drafting. The manifesto wants to move the fighting to the blueprint stage, where it's safe to ask the hard questions.
That leads perfectly into the 4th proposal, which is more about culture, redefining responsibility.
This is the hardest one, I think. The source calls for a cultural shift, where admitting something isn't working feels less like a personal failure and more like simple maintenance.
Maintenance. I like that. It's like if my car breaks down, I don't have an identity crisis, I just fix the car. But if a policy fails, it's a massive scandal.
Right. And because it's a scandal, politicians will double down on bad ideas rather than just admit they need tweaking. If we viewed policy more like software where you expect bugs and you just release a patch, governance would be so much healthier.
So we have a smoother calendar, longer tenure for the people in charge, arguing early on the process, and treating failure like maintenance.
And notice what the expert commentary in the source says about this list. It says, none of that guarantees better outcomes.
Well, that's not a great slogan for a bumper sticker, is it? Vote for us. We don't guarantee anything.
But listen to the second half of that sentence. It says, but it does make better outcomes more plausible. That's the key. You can't guarantee a good law. Humans are messy. But you can build a system where a good law is maybe 10% more likely to survive, and a bad law is 10% more likely to get caught early. Over 20 years, that compound interest is enormous.
This brings us to what the source calls the ambition of modesty. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? On paper, this whole program looks, well, totally underwhelming.
It does. There are no ribbon-cutting moments here. You can't stand in front of a smoother calendar and look like a hero.
I have successfully rescheduled the Tuesday meeting. Yeah, no one's applauding for that.
But the source argues that this lack of glamour is actually its greatest strength. And here's why. It doesn't depend on a government being uniquely wise or uniquely virtuous.
That is a relief, honestly. Relying on politicians to be uniquely virtuous feels like a very risky bet.
It is. If your system requires a great man or a political savior to work, it is a bad system. This manifesto depends on leaving behind a system that rewards patience a little more than performance. It wants to create a system where memory has somewhere to live, where learning doesn't just reset every few years.
So it's designing a system for the person who comes after you.
Exactly. And that is a rare form of political altruism. It's about checking your ego at the door. You aren't trying to be the hero who solved everything. You're trying to be the custodian who left the building in better shape than you found it.
Even if the person coming in after you is someone you totally, fundamentally disagree with.
That's the kicker. That's the really hard part. But the argument is that a functional system serves everyone better than a broken one, even your opponents. Delegation amplifies thinking rather than just buffering instability.
Meaning right now, we give power to people just to keep the chaos at bay. But we want to give power to people so they can actually think.
Correct. It's moving from a survival mindset to a growth mindset, but structurally.
So let's bring this all back to the listener. We've gone through the one-term manifesto. We've seen that the real enemies are this churn, this compression and forgetfulness. And we've seen that the fixes are kind of boring things like calendars and tenure.
And we've seen that the goal isn't a solved system, but a system that is just slightly easier to think in.
What does this all mean for us? Why should the average person really care about parliamentary calendars?
I think it connects to how we view progress. We are all conditioned to look for the great revolution, the one big thing that fixes everything. But this deep dive suggests that real, lasting continuity comes from the plumbing.
It's the difference between buying a flashy new car and actually changing the oil in the one you have so it lasts.
Or to use the source's framing. It's all about legacy. A one-term manifesto isn't about what you achieve for yourself. It's about whether the machine is running better when you hand over the keys than when you first got them.
That concept of conditions over outcomes is something I think applies to everything. If you're a manager, a parent, a team leader, you can't force the outcome. You can't force your kid to be a genius. You can't force your team to have a breakthrough.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
If you just demand the outcome, all you get is stress and bad ideas. You get churn and compression in your own living room or your own office.
But you can set the conditions. You can make it safe to fail. You can give people enough time. You can stop changing the rules every single week.
Exactly. You are designing the environment for success rather than trying to mandate success itself.
The source ends with a really heavy question, and I want to leave our listeners with this. It says, if we don't design for that kind of continuity on purpose, what are we implicitly choosing instead?
That hit me hard when I read it, because the default isn't neutral. If we don't actively choose continuity, we are implicitly choosing the churn. We are choosing the amnesia. We are choosing to let the system forget everything it learned just 5 years ago.
We are choosing to run on a treadmill, sweating, panicking, moving very, very fast, but going absolutely nowhere.
And that is a choice. It's a passive choice, but it is a choice nonetheless.
So the next time you hear a massive political promise, we will rewrite the Constitution. Maybe ask yourself the boring questions. That sounds great. But what are you doing about the calendar? What are you doing about the churn? Because if you don't fix the boring stuff, the big stuff will never matter.
Amen to that. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is just making sure the meeting starts on time and the minutes are kept properly.
The ambition of modesty. It's a powerful idea. Thanks for helping us unpack this one.
My pleasure.
And for you listening, think about your own one term. If you knew you were leaving your job in a year, what would you fix so it didn't fall apart the day you left? That's the real question. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.